Welcome to the Duke Law School and to our program in which we remember John Hope Franklin as a member of this faculty. And we've called it A Life in Law and History, and the conjunction is really important because for a long time it was a life in law or history. We're honored to have the distinguished panelists before you, Professor Thavolia Glymph, William Leuchtenburg, and Walter Dellinger, and they're going to speak about their perspectives on John Hope Franklin and his work, and I will talk about them momentarily. From the very beginning, John Hope Franklin lived a life that was steeped in law and in history. He was born in Rendiesville, Oklahoma, on January 2nd, 1915. His grandfather was a former slave and was a remarkable man who became a considerable rancher. Sometime you might look at the book that John Hope Franklin and his son, Whit Franklin, who I went to high school with, wrote together, prepared together, and it's John Hope's father's autobiography. And in the autobiography, his father, Buck Colbert Franklin, speaks at length about his own father, this former slave who became a force on the frontier, as it was then, on the panhandle of Oklahoma. Buck Colbert Franklin was one of the first black lawyers in the Oklahoma Indian Territory, and Professor John Hope Franklin used to say that his father's pride in being a lawyer was not matched by his mastery of the economics of law practice. Fortunately, his mother, Molly Parker Franklin, was a school teacher and also a very considerable leader in her community. The realities of racism hit John Hope Franklin at an early age and continued throughout much of his adult life. He vividly remembered the experience of being put off the train with his mother because she refused to move to the segregated compartment. He was 6 years old at the time. This was a big year for John Hope Franklin. When he was 6, he went with his father to court, and I've heard him tell this story. He accompanied his father, and when his father's case was called, his father stood up, as lawyers will do, to go to the podium, and John Hope, the young child of 6, stood up with his father and went to the podium with him. And the judge was quite amused by this, and he said to the young John Hope, "Well, what would you like to be when you grow up?" And he said, "I want to be the first Negro president of the United States." And at a dinner party last fall, in October, I believe it was, at Coleman's house, at my prompting, John Hope told this story. And Professor Kathy Davidson was there, and she said, not missing a beat, "John Hope, it looks like you're going to have to settle for second." And I can tell you he was very happy to settle for second. In 1931, Dr. Franklin enrolled at Fisk University, and he intended to study law. But his history professor, Theodore Currier, inspired him to a love of history, and in fact lent him the $500 that the young man needed to attend graduate school at Harvard University, where he received his master's and then his doctorate. And the rest, as they say, is history. Or was it? Or was it? Well, it certainly began that way because Dr. Franklin taught history at Fisk and then at what became North Carolina Central University, then Howard, then Brooklyn, and then the University of Chicago, where my family came to know him so well. He wrote his path-breaking work of African American history from slavery to freedom in the 1940s. And then in the early 1950s, he did the history work for a team of lawyers headed by Thurgood Marshall. And of course, that was the very significant case of Brown versus Board of Education. In 1982, he came to Duke, and he taught in the history department. He retired from the history department in 1985, and then a wonderful thing happened for us here at the law school. John Hope Franklin could resist the law no longer, and he joined the law school's faculty for 7 precious years. At Duke Law School, Dr. Franklin taught constitutional history with Walter Dellinger and Bill Leuchtenburg. And we've heard from many of our graduates who say that this course was the most inspiring and the most important experience of their law school career. John Hope Franklin used to say, and I've heard him say this often, that his life as a historian would not have been complete except for those 7 years that he spent here in our law school. The John Hope Franklin Chair in American Legal History that is endowed, has just been endowed here at the law school, will carry on the legacy of Professor Franklin's work. And so we are so fortunate here today to celebrate this wonderful life in law and history with 3 of John Hope Franklin's colleagues. Thavolia Glymph is an associate professor of history and acting chair of the African and African American Studies Department at Duke. Her scholarly interests include Southern United States history, slavery, the Civil War, emancipation, and Southern women. And when I tell you that she has a love of orchids, you will understand the deep connection that she had with John Hope Franklin. William Leuchtenburg is the William Rand Keenan Jr. Professor Emeritus of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is one of the nation's most distinguished historians. He is one of the foremost experts on the U.S. presidency and the leading authority on the life of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Walter Dellinger, known probably to everyone in this building, is the Douglas B. Maggs Professor Emeritus of Law and Chair of the Appellate Practice Group at O'Melveny & Myers. He is one of the most distinguished lawyers in the nation and one of the finest Supreme Court advocates that we have had. We will begin with Dr. Glymph.
Do I sit here or come there?
I'm going to go to the podium.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here in this company where John spent his last academic years, and I'd like to really thank Dean Levi for inviting me to be in this distinguished company of faculty, students, alumni, and the panelists. I've known Dr. Franklin for close to 30 years. I was a little baby when we met. It's not true. I met him at a conference as a graduate student, and so we knew each other in passing and conversations from conferences over the years. And when I moved to Durham, to Duke in 2000, he became a buddy, a pal, a mentor, and to me and to my children, especially my son, and became, he convinced me that I could grow orchids, and he gave me my first ones. And so it's a real pleasure when I go home today, these days, to see them in full bloom. Dr. Franklin wrote many, many years ago, many decades ago, that, quote, the law, the courts, the schools, and almost every institution favored whites. This was white supremacy. That he wrote in 1947 in From Slavery to Freedom. As I sat down last night to jot down a few notes for this program, it occurred to me as I began to think about Dr. Franklin's role as a historian, his engagement with history and law, the connections between legal history and the history of race, and how all of this came together in his remarkable work. It occurred to me that this is probably the easiest assignment I've had in a long time. And at once, the most pleasurable and at the same time I acknowledge the tremendous loss that this occasion represents. 2 decades ago this month, reflecting on his life, Dr. Franklin wrote, quote, I grew up believing that in the evenings one either wrote or read. It was always easy to read something worthwhile, and if one worked at it hard enough, he might even write something worthwhile, end quote. That quote stays with me because it was also the way I grew up in South Carolina. Dr. Franklin, however, might just as easily have written that he grew up in the law, surrounded by it, as a black person engulfed in it, in ways no white American could imagine. And this was not merely or even especially because his father was an attorney and at one point served also as the Justice of the Peace while he farmed and was postmaster, but also because Dr. Franklin's life was hemmed in by the law on all sides. From the all-black town of Rentisville, where he was born, which in itself was a product of segregation, as much as it was a product of the determination of people like his parents to defy white supremacy. It was the law which led to him being ejected along with his mother and sister from that train when his mother refused to sit in the Negro section. It was the law which permitted the destruction of what became his home, Tulsa, in 1921, where his father had relocated to practice law. It was the law that sent him to the inferior Booker T. Washington School, rather than the better equipped Central High, where one could study the Romantic languages and much more. It was the law that permitted the lynching of Cordy Cheek for striking, though not injuring, a white child while riding his bike. And it was the law that permitted the segregated archives that he journeyed to do the work that we would all come to respect and better understand history as a result. It was the law and custom that made his first forays not only into the archives but into the history profession so difficult and often demeaning. But he overcame all of that, as we all know, to become president of all of the leading historical associations, from the Organization of American Historians to the Southern Historical Association, and many more. It was unsurprising, it seems in retrospect, that it was the law that Dr. Franklin hoped to pursue as a career. In the end, of course, having seen the power of history as a student at Fisk under Theodore Currier, he left Fisk to study at Harvard. He became then one of the nation's most important historians, leaving a scholarly corpus of work that is unrivaled in many, many fundamental ways. There have been other scholars who may have written more books or published more articles, but none has had the impact of Dr. Franklin. More than any other historian or scholar of American history, and I emphasize that because Dr. Franklin, though he wrote a lot about the African American experience, he was always eager, ready to remind us that he was an American historian. Certainly, though others may have published more than any other scholar, he carried the intellectual legacy of a person who preceded him at Harvard to become the first Black PhD in history there, Dr. Du Bois. One is astonished in the study of history, Du Bois would write, at the recurrence of the idea that all evil must be forgotten, distorted, skimmed over. We must forget that George Washington was a slave owner and simply remember the things we regard as creditable and inspiring. The difficulty, Du Bois concluded, of course, with this philosophy is that history loses its value as an incentive and example. It paints perfect men and noble nations, but it does not tell the truth, end quote. Dr. Franklin, over the course of his life as a scholar and as a citizen of the world, worked to ensure that we told the truth, that we did not simply remember the things we regard as credible or inspiring. He told the truth about what historian Thomas Holt has described as, quote, the noxious weed of racism, end quote. He told the truth about the ground that nourishes that racism. In the last decades of his life, even as he continued to write major work, he became an even more determined activist, more determined to make the connections between history and law, more determined to show that state action can right racial wrongs and injustices of all manner. It was not just slavery, he said over and over again during his last years, but it was also the long century of Jim Crow and segregation that required our attention and our energies. He did not shy from tackling the harsh and the difficult truths. Indeed, he never had. Dr. Franklin believed that there is a we in the American story, that there is a we in American history. Long before President Obama articulated the hope for a united America, Dr. Franklin had pushed in his scholarship and in his growing moral stature to argue that the field of African American history was not some marginalized field, but part and parcel of American history. I will, and I could go on, but I know the main attraction here is to talk about the work that he did at the law school and the colleagues that he taught those courses with. I will just conclude by saying that as we remember Dr. Franklin and his engagement with the law and history, we remember not only his remarkable work in legal cases like Brown versus the Board of Education, but we also remember his legal work in cases like Patterson versus McLean Credit Bureau. We remember his going to Selma to continue that march. And I will remember Dr. Franklin most for teaching all of us how to live scholarly yet human and humane lives, for showing us how to walk the earth upright with integrity and grace, how to live so that the footprints we leave behind make a difference in our common search for justice and the pursuit of knowledge. He was a dear friend, and like all of you and people all over the world, I will miss him immensely. We have lost a giant of a man, but he left us all so much better people than we might otherwise have been. Thank you.
John Hope and I were friends for more than 50 years. And I can barely bear his loss. When a reporter called me up with the news and asked for a comment, I said that the world is a lonelier place. I started teaching at Columbia in 1952, and John Hope arrived as chair of the history department at Brooklyn College just 4 years later. And soon thereafter, without being very conscious that we were doing this, we began a quiet collaboration. I remember the first time that I called him, I had a graduate student I hoped would want to work on the NAACP at a time when, unhappily, not very much was being done in African American history. And I asked John Hope what he knew about the accessibility of the NAACP papers. One particular instance, there is a historian named Richard Polenberg who, it has been said, taught more students than anybody else in the history of Cornell University. Richard Polenberg began his interest in history as an undergraduate at Brooklyn College, where he came to adore John Hope. And he finished his graduate work, his PhD, with me at Columbia. In the years since then, we've been together on numerous occasions. We marched together with Martin Luther King in Montgomery. We were fellows together at the National Humanities Center. With our dear friend Walter Dellinger, we testified before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee. And above all, we taught a course together for a good many years here at Duke Law School. But most of all, I remember the many lovely evenings at his home on Pineview Road in Durham, where he and Aurelia, to whom he was married for more than half a century. It is significant that the day for the service in honor of him here at Duke Chapel in June will be on their wedding anniversary, where that home radiated such warmth that you felt it come out to meet you even before you crossed the threshold. Our course at Duke Law School, the course with Walter and John Hope, may well have been the most exhilarating experience I had in 57 years of college teaching. But there's not a very great deal that I can say about John Hope and that course, because though it's often not remembered that way today, it was not team taught. The year was divided in three parts. Walter talked about the creation of the Constitution. John Hope, in the second third, talked about the Civil War and Reconstruction and the Supreme Court cases of that period. And then I came in the final third and talked about the constitutional crisis of the 1930s and how that affects the law today or later. And as a result, we had no real reason to be together, though Walter did me the honor to come into my lectures more than once. I'm confident, though, that it was a very important experience for John Hope. He had to be sure had an acquaintance with the law because he assisted counsel in Brown v. Board. But to my knowledge, he had not had before a law school tie. I, on the other hand, had taught for a great many years at Columbia Law School a seminar with Benno Schmidt on the Supreme Court in the age of Holmes and Brandeis. And I had, in fact, taught at Duke Law School before this course was put together. But for John Hope, the transition was much more abrupt. And I think it affected his view of history. For the first time, he had to see historical events through the eyes of lawyers, through the eyes of judges. And I know he shared in the enthusiasm of the students. It was a course in a large classroom where every seat was taken, and some people squatted on the floor, and some lounged against the hall of the walls on the back of the room. And finally, a point was reached where third-year law students were admitted by lottery because there was no more room safely in that room. And since I immediately followed John Hope in the course, I know what the law school students thought about him, and not merely how much they learned from him, but how much they admired him. And I'm sure they conveyed that to John Hope. There are just two final points I'd like to make at the outset. One concerns John Hope's temperament. He achieved so much despite having to cope with so many outrageous indignities. When his father, who is, as has been said, was an attorney in Indian Territory before it became Oklahoma, moved to Tulsa, the building where he'd acquired a law office was burned down by a white mob. And for months, his father had to work out of a tent. When, as a graduate student, John Hope sought to pursue archival research in Raleigh, he was not permitted to sit with white researchers, but was shunted off to an isolated room. The Library of Congress was still worse. I recall that when, in 1946, I was the only white on the field staff of a civil rights lobby headed by A. Philip Randolph, I could not eat with my colleagues at any downtown restaurant, not even at the greasiest People's Drugstore counter. Nor, after having fought a victorious war against fascism, was there a downtown movie a black veteran could go to, a downtown hotel at which, in the nation's capital, he could take his family. That was John Hope's experience. During the same period, on a train journey in North Carolina, from Greensboro to Durham, he was compelled to stand, so there were ample seats in the next coach, because those coach seats were reserved for whites, who sat there grinning at his discomfort. They were Nazi prisoners of war. It would be nice to say, thank God, that's all behind us now. But even in recent years, this great man, who was accorded so many honors, who anyone could see at a glance was a courtly gentleman of enormous dignity and imposing presence, it could not, in the cosmopolitan city of New York, hail a cab without apprehension that it would not stop for him because he was black. Yet despite all that I've said, and all that I've not had occasion to say, all to which he was subjected, John Hope was conspicuously a man of equipoise. Everyone who ever knew him has marveled at how a man who had to endure what he had to endure could have such a sweetness of temperament. That alone would be remarkable, but still more remarkable is the fact that he was able to combine that equable composure with a courageous commitment to speak out against injustice. I'm sure that Walter will remember a moment when, in the Senate hearings, when we were testifying against the confirmation of Robert Bork. The hearings were over, we were dismissed, and the truculent senator from Wyoming, Senator Simpson, scolded us, said that next time there weren't going to be any hearings, next time you weren't going to have a chance to say what you said. And John Hope, completely out of line, said to the chair, Joe Biden, may I ask a question? And he then said to Senator Simpson, Senator, are you telling me that the next time there's a nomination, we're not going to be allowed to speak? And Simpson backed away, mumbled a few words, and said, no, you'll be able to come. And John Hope said, I'll be back. My other and final point is one I've not seen in the many good things that have been said in recent days. That John Hope was a proud American. This has been touched on in the first remarks. One of his friends of many years, and a friend of mine, C. Van Woodward at Yale, chanced to describe John Hope, I think it was in the New York Review of Books, as the foremost African-American historian in the country. John Hope was furious. It was not that he did not take pride in being an African-American, he did not want to be segmented. He was an American historian. And I recall one particular evening during the Carter years when we were guests at a dinner party in Chapel Hill. And the host said, why are we creating such a fuss about the captivity in Tehran? Why is it that we're risking a possible conflict over this? After all, there are only a few of them, and they put themselves at risk. And John Hope responded with a voice that resounded through the room, because we are Americans. And as the LA Times said, John Hope carried on a lifelong quarrel with whites, whom he regarded as exasperating relatives. And both points have to be remembered. Exasperating, surely, but still his relatives. And that's how we ought to be thinking of him, as one of the truly great Americans of the 20th century.
Here's how it happened, the Duke Law School course. I decided around 1980 that I needed to really learn about the original understanding of the Constitution, that too many people never studied the debates in the Constitutional Convention. I tried to do it on my own and did not have the discipline, so I scheduled a course. And with students showing up every week, you had to do the reading. And we read the debates in the Constitutional Convention from May 25th, 1787 to September 17th, when the convention rose and submitted its work. After a year of that, we had a very fortunate event for our faculty that the Dean, Paul Carrington, asked William Leuchtenburg of UNC to teach a seminar for the faculty, a series of lectures that the faculty would come to in the lounge, where Professor Leuchtenburg would teach us about the New Deal crisis of legitimacy in American constitutional law. And the faculty loved doing this collegial scholarly activity. And Dean Carrington wondered, how could we offer that to our students? It would only support one credit, and a one-credit course isn't viable. And approached me about appending the New Deal piece to what I did about the constitutional founding. So for, I think, a year, we had this odd course of the summer of 1787, and then the period from really beginning in 1929 through 1938 that Bill Leuchtenburg taught. And then one Sunday morning in the mid-1980s, I saw in the local paper that Dr. John Hope Franklin was giving a talk at UNC. I'd met him only once, and as Bill says, he fills the room when he walks into a dinner gathering. There was about him a sense of majesty, a courtly dignity, sharply focused eyes surmounted a large and easy smile. He was keenly interested in everyone else's story, I noted that night. And when he spoke, like everyone else, I was riveted. So that Sunday afternoon, I went to hear him speak. The topic was in search of George Washington Williams. He had discovered the fact that there was an African-American adventurer and writer in the second half of the 19th century, George Washington Williams, who John Hope stumbled upon, had written a book, The History of the Negro Race in America, 1619 to 1880, a book that had been forgotten, as had George Washington Williams. And John Hope sought to track down George Washington Williams throughout his service in the Union Army, his work in the Congo, his confrontation with King Leopold, his writing of this history, his death in a seaport town in England, and told this riveting story which he wrote into a biography of George Washington Williams so that he would not be forgot, nor would, of course, John Hope. And then it hit me. This is the missing piece of this course. We have the founding. We have the New Deal crisis. But what about the mid-course correction? The Civil War, the 14th Amendment. So with some hesitancy, I called and asked to meet with Dr. Franklin and proposed that he join this course and teach the middle part. And it was an extraordinarily lucky event because you ended the Constitutional Convention realizing that the tensions over slavery that had smoldered for much of the summer broke forth at the end and that there was going to be the tension at the heart of this new Constitution. And then John Hope would begin with the fugitive slave cases of the 1840s, take us through the Civil War, all the constitutional issues, Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, the war power, the use of the war power to proclaim emancipation through Plessy against Ferguson, and then Bill would teach the New Deal. I learned one thing, if I ever return to full-time teaching: do not ever co-teach a course with two professors who regularly move students to tears. Do not do that. Of course, what was most wonderful was the colleagueship. I did sit in on, for several years, all of John Hope's lectures and all of Bill's lectures. And it was an extraordinary experience for me to do that. John Hope got royalty checks from Slavery to Freedom once a quarter, and the arrangement was that he would take me out to lunch when the royalty check came. He said at this point it's lagniappe, and he wanted to share it, and I extended it that anytime either one of us got an honorary degree or a prize in excess of $10,000, we would take the other to lunch. This is the best investment I ever made. I cannot tell you how far ahead I ended up on this deal. The wonderful Aurelia Franklin was always amused by my red convertible and the fact that John Hope would wear a pork pie hat, and we would leave their driveway. She would always wave us off for lunch, where I learned, of course, the wonderful stories, the childhood stories of John Hope growing up in Rinceville. And he would tell the most painful stories in the most beguiling way. His years at Fisk University, meeting Aurelia there. As you noted, his white professor taking out a second mortgage on his home to make sure that John Hope could attend Harvard University for his PhD. Back to Durham and Raleigh to teach at Shaw. He would tell the most wonderful stories. Back in Raleigh, he had his second meeting with the great W.E.B. Du Bois of the four periods in his life. The first was at age 11, he heard Du Bois speak. And then knowing that Du Bois was going to be staying at the Hotel for Colored in Raleigh, John Hope arranged to go there because he knew that Dr. Du Bois took his breakfast in the hotel. Du Bois, resplendent in white suit, Panama hat, would be reading the newspaper when John Hope Franklin approached him. And he spoke and he said, "Dr. Du Bois, my name is John Hope Franklin. I am named for your mentor, John Hope." Turning of the newspaper. And then he said, "I, like you, attended Fisk University. I am completing my dissertation for my PhD at Harvard, where he would be the second African American to get his PhD in history after Dr. Du Bois." Finally, Du Bois peers up and said, "Young man, what is any of that to me?" And John Hope speaks of backing across the room. That was the entirety of his segment. Then they became great friends and colleagues. And then finally, at the end of Du Bois' life, when Du Bois had been captured by sort of the American Communist Party, and at his death, there was sort of a communist-run memorial service. Nobody wanted John Hope there, not the group that surrounded Du Bois, and not his friends who said you can't go and be associated with. He went to speak about Du Bois and Du Bois' American life, undeterred by fear of association and undeterred by those who didn't want him there. That he went there, he traveled to Brooklyn to make that commitment. Back in North Carolina, he talked about trying to write while teaching at the colleges here. The teaching load was enormous. He had a shared office with many other faculty members. He taught all the time. And he was trying to write a history His dissertation was on free blacks in North Carolina in the 1840s, and trying to expand upon that, working off of their small kitchen table, until Aurelia said, "This will never work while you're teaching and trying to do this on a kitchen table. You need to go to the Library of Congress, and we can live on what I can make as a librarian." So reluctantly, John Hope left Aurelia. She sent him money each week. He went off to Washington and spent a year at the Library of Congress, where he, as he said, he broke the back of that book. It came out in 1947. Dr. Levering Lewis, David Levering Lewis, says of it is, when you think of from slavery to freedom, there's before and there's after. He moved the study of African Americans into the main American narrative and empowered not just African American studies, but a whole range of alternative studies and histories. He transformed how we see the histories of America by making this part of the mainstream. He saw himself very much as a Southern historian. And he was, one of his points of pride was being the first African American to present a paper at the Southern Historical Association. He told me that when he got the recognition, got him the offer to Howard University, where all of the great African American scholars studied, the teachers of Thurgood Marshall, the great academics were there. And when he arrived on the campus at Howard in his 30s, he said he was overwhelmed by a sense of depression. And that is because it had been his life goal to someday be appointed to the faculty at Howard. And he had no idea it would come as early in his 30s. And he knew when he stepped on the campus that there was nothing else he could achieve in life. There would be no other university that he could go to, having gone to the preeminent African American university, that he was there, and he looked forward to the fact that there was nowhere else for him to go. Then came more fame, international lecturing, and the overtures from Brooklyn College, part of that great sense of New York, the New York schools in the 40s and 50s, that were the great, exciting centers of learning at like Brooklyn College. When John Hope was named chair of the Department of History at Brooklyn College, the New York Times ran the story on its front page: Negro to chair academic department at White University, the first in America. And it is, I've seen that New York Times. I've held it in my hands that John Hope has. It is astounding to realize that by their education writer, Edward B. Fisk, was a front page story in the New York Times. From there to Chicago, where he met others here. And then finally, and correctly and rightly, back home to the South to teach at Duke in history, and then finally in law. He lived the life of the scholar and the life of the participant. I love the pictures of John Hope on the march from Selma to Montgomery. A historian, as someone wrote at the time, they're less as an act of protest than that of historical witness. I'm not sure I think that's right. I think he was there equally as an act of protest and as a historical witness, but one could certainly say that the man who documented the history of Black America was then a first-hand participant in one of its essential chapters, which he himself was to record. The New York Review of Books wrote a piece, an article on John Hope, one of his works that he thought had him just right, that there's no great school of thought associated with John Hope, because he eschewed schools of thought because he thought it's so important to be correct and objective, and rigorously so, giving the path that he was pursuing. Well, when I heard that he had passed away, I thought, why hadn't I written something knowing that he was 94? I guess because you just don't write something against that day. So I sat down late at dinner time and had about 30 minutes to try to write something for the next morning's paper. And with some emendations, I'll read it now. I would say one more thing that's not in it. His devotion to Aurelia was astounding. And while she could scarcely remember him in her last period of confinement, he visited her every day. He liked to do her laundry himself to make sure it was done right and to maintain that connection. So I'll end with this. John Hope Franklin, who died at 94, was one of the most remarkable Americans of the 20th century. He was the master of the great American story of the century, the story of race. John Hope wrote it, he taught it, and he lived it. For 7 years, he and I taught constitutional history together at Duke, and I never ceased to marvel at how he managed to both embody this history and yet recount it with an extraordinarily candid honesty. Our students would fall into hush while he recounted his experiences researching his epic 1947 From Slavery to Freedom in segregated libraries at Southern universities and Southern state libraries. He would describe the various Jim Crow rules he was required to navigate: a separate table from white patrons, a prohibition on being waited on by white female librarians, and similar indignities without a trace of bitterness. After the acclaim for From Slavery to Freedom and his other writings brought him a place on the Howard University faculty while he was still in his 30s, John Hope thought that he had achieved the final academic appointment of his life. History proved him wrong. In 1956, when Brooklyn College made him the first African American appointed to a chair in academic departments at a predominantly white institution, the story was reported on the front page. John Hope never compromised on principle. In fact, it is true to say of him that there was about him a fierce militancy. It is hard to describe and hold in one's mind both the fierce militancy and the genial kindness. But somehow in John Hope, they merged and merged in a way that made an integrated whole. He told and retold his one compromise with principle, the story of the decision he made as a young teenager in Tulsa to see a performance by a star of the Metropolitan Opera. His parents strongly disapproved of his decision since it entailed sitting in a segregated balcony. He wrote later, "I am not altogether proud of going to the convention hall, and there are times even now, while enjoying a symphony or an opera, when I reproach myself for having yielded to the indignity of racial segregation." He worked on the crucial brief in Brown versus the Board. He marched in Selma. He lectured all over the world, and he taught America to see through his uncompromising eye. But it was not just what he did, but how he did it that marked his greatness. He understood that the public good was not merely a set of substantive outcomes. It is also defined by how we go about reconciling our competing visions of the public good. It is about how we view one another when we peer across the divides of policy, preference, political party, and personhood. John Hope Franklin looked at those who opposed him and saw fellow human beings. He was no Pollyanna. He knew, as my son Drew once wrote, that we are still always crossing that bridge from Selma to Montgomery. But John Hope always looked at the state trooper blocking the bridge, that figure standing in the way of freedom, and he saw there another child of God. He knew, as Charles L. Black once said, that the tragedy of Southern race relations was drawn from that prima materia of all tragedy, the failure to recognize kinship. Exasperating relatives. The failure, he knew it was drawn from the failure to recognize kinship. When Barack Obama emerged as a possible candidate for president, I asked John Hope how historic it would be if Obama won his party's nomination, and he replied that the significance of such a thing would be beyond measure. And it would counter, he said, that would counter one of the most dominant narratives of the past 350 years on this continent. And then he added very presciently the thought that it might be even more culturally and historically important to have that family as the first family in the White House than to have Obama as president. When the roll was called in Denver and the Democratic Convention by acclamation made Obama its nominee, I stepped outside and called John Hope. I asked him the question so many of us ask each other, particularly those of us from the South, did you ever think you would live to see this day? And I asked that to this man who could not ride in the white car, could not attend school with whites, could not be admitted to a state university at the University of Oklahoma, never thought he could ever teach at a white university. I asked him that question. In his resonant baritone, he said, I never expected to live more than 90 years. But he said, even if I had, I still would not have thought that would be long enough to see this happen. That he did live into this year seems a very special gift. Thank you.
Thank all of you for joining us in this recollection and appreciation of our friend, our colleague, our teacher, and our inspiration, John Hope Franklin. Thank you very much.